Hello, thank you for tuning in to this week's TAL update. I have the honor today of interviewing Professor Collett. She has a longstanding history of working with Dr. Poyman from the early roots of this organization when it actually had a different name before it was Texas Alliance for Life. And her work in the pro-life movement and in general as a professor has evolved and grown over time. And so I'm excited to have you with us, Professor Collett. I would like to get to know you better in my interview today, as well as give our viewers a chance to get to know you and the great work that you do. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Amy. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to work with your viewers again.
Awesome. Well, I would actually love to start with kind of your history in working with Dr. Poyman and Texas Alliance for Life. Can you tell us a little bit about how you guys first met, when your work began, and kind of how you got involved with us early on?
Sure. One of the early stages of my academic career, I was at South Texas College of Law down in Houston. And as a young mother and as a lawyer, had been involved in the pro-life movement, at least tangentially. Before becoming an academic, I was particularly interested in the fact that at the time, Texas had no parental involvement law related to abortion. And certainly as the mother of two young daughters, as well as a son, it seemed to me outrageous that someone could perform any sort of surgical procedure on my children without notifying me and obtaining my consent without consultation. So there was a bill that was introduced to the Texas House. Then Representative DeLisi was the sponsor, and she was a delightful and very smart lady. But she was a school teacher. She wasn't a lawyer. And I had contacted her office and said, I'd be delighted to testify in favor of this bill. I hope you'll, allow me to do that. Of course, Texas has open testimony, unlike Congress, where you have to be invited. And so she said, certainly, here's the hearings. Meanwhile, there was a member of the House who was chairing the committee who kept trying to persuade her that there should be a rebuttable presumption of parental involvement. And your viewers may or may not be familiar with that concept, but there are certain things in law that you can assume to be true, but if they're not, then you can simply enter evidence into the record, and so you can avoid it. And I kept saying to her, if you make it a rebuttable presumption, the abortion industry will come in every time into these secret judicial bypass hearings, which the Supreme Court at the time required, or at least most lawyers thought it was required, so that young girls could be escorted by an abortion-minded lawyer to the judge, talk privately to the judge, and the judge would say, well, this girl's sufficiently mature to make the decision. And ultimately, I persuaded her that it cannot be a rebuttable presumption. It had to be an irrebuttable presumption. But I began working with Joe and with Chris Maska at that point as we were working hard to get this passed. It was a huge victory. I remember the night they had the most significant hearing. There were lawyers in from New York City, from Planned Parenthood, from a variety of abortion rights organizations. And they held the pro-life testimony. We didn't get to start till 1 in the morning.
Wow.
And we had a physician who had to be back at his office down in San Antonio. And it was a deliberate ploy to, weed out the witnesses and to make the legislative record read very differently. And so, but the good doctor stayed, as did I. And it was a long night, but we ultimately won on that one. And then, of course, there were a series of cases before the Texas Supreme Court trying to interpret the law. And I served on the Texas Supreme Court committee drafting the rules. And there were huge battles in the rule drafting committee. And then as these cases began to emerge, I also participated in the cases as a lawyer. So
that's fascinating history, and actually learned something new about
irrebuttable and rebuttable presumptions.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to be looking that up later. I'm not a lawyer. I'm actually a biomedical engineer by background, and everything I have learned about law in general, I've learned through what I do here. And so I'm ever building, ever learning. And I imagine some of our viewers are finding that information new today as well. But it's interesting to me that people fought so hard about something as simple as parental notification. To me, it should be a no-brainer. And I know that even now, Joe, still thinking back on that law's passage, just celebrates the fact that it passed. But it took a lot of work and it took a lot of effort. And so I applaud you guys who worked so hard for that. It says a lot about where the makeup was of our legislature at the time, kind of compared to where it is today. But we still saw pro-life gains happen. And so many of the gains that we've made over time have been incremental. And that's one of the great incremental gains, as well as the Prenatal Protection Act, which I believe that you were also involved with in Texas. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so I've had the opportunity to testify in front of the Texas legislature fairly routinely while we were down in Houston. And I was at the university, or at South Texas College of Law, for 11 years, and they were wonderful years. I remember I had the bumper sticker that said, I wasn't born here, but I got here as soon as I could about Texas. And I will say, we felt called to come up to Minnesota to assist in the reopening of a law school at a Catholic university. But there isn't a day that's gone by that I haven't missed Texas and my friends and the devotion of the pro-life movement in that state. In Minnesota, we're struggling. We have a state constitutional interpretation that, in my mind, is completely historically unfounded, similar to Roe v. Wade. And we just got this past week a horrific district court opinion that struck down our parental involvement law. It struck down our physician only requirement. We're in a very different place than Texas. And my husband tries to comfort me that we're so far away from what I consider sort of my native state, that there's a reason God brought us here. But it's a much different fight here than it is in Texas. You've got great people there, including Joe and Chris and your governor and your attorney general and people like you.
Oh, thank you. It is a very different climate here right now, I would say, when it comes to the life issue and just the climate in general. I hope you're at least enjoying not having the over 100-degree weather that we're having here. It has been the hottest summer, but Texas does have a way of finding its way into our soul, I believe. And so once we've been here, it's hard not to want to be here. It's such a beautiful state in general, but I appreciate the work that you're doing where you are. And it's just a reminder again that the fight really is continuing across the country. So many people thought the overturning of Dobbs would mean that abortion was outlawed. There were a lot of people who just didn't understand what that meant. And so I have learned in kind of reading about you that you contributed 3 briefs towards the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization case. And I would love to just hear a little bit about how your pro-life story progressed from what you did as a professor here, and then your academic growth to your professorship where you are now, and then writing briefs, and then the 3 briefs you did. If you could just explain a little bit about those as well, that would be great for our viewers to hear kind of that progression and how you contributed to this amazing case.
Sure. Well, part of it's also the history of the University of St. Thomas Law School. The reality is that the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota is very different than the University of St. Thomas in Houston. The University of St. Thomas in Houston is a very faith-filled place. They've got great leadership, and they are intent on combining faith and reason in the way that the Catholic Church has called on all Catholic universities and colleges to do. The University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, on the other hand, we're not Georgetown. We're not completely lost. And of course, we know nothing is ever completely lost.
Right.
But we do have a serious cultural problem in the way that a majority of the faculty at St. Thomas understand human sexuality, understand some of the key family formation, et cetera. And so the law school here, even with only 1/5 of our faculty being political conservatives, is considered one of the more conservative units at the University. And so when we had Michael Paulson join us, someone who some of your viewers may be familiar with, Mike is an excellent writer, a pro-life warrior from long back, as well as myself. Mike asked that they set up something called a pro-life center here. Unfortunately, he didn't ask for funding. So the good news is that we get free use of university facilities, and we can hold sessions here, like University Faculty for Life will be here next summer, a great national organization of pro-life faculty from across the country. The bad news is that it is an unfunded opportunity, but because it exists, it allows me to file briefs in important cases on behalf of the Pro-Life Center at the University of St. Thomas. So one of the 3 briefs that I wrote was with Paul Linton, who is the former general counsel for Americans United for Life. You may have interviewed Paul before.
He's actually our legal counsel here at Texas Alliance for Life as well. He's a brain. I love to just hear his thoughts on everything. Yes.
Absolutely brilliant, and a joy to work with.
Funny. Yeah.
So, we were concerned that even if the Dobbs case were to accept the position of Mississippi, which it ultimately did, and reverse Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, that they would not speak directly to Doe v. Bolton. And as many of your viewers know, and I know you know, Doe v. Bolton was the companion case to Roe versus Wade that established that all abortion laws needed a health exception, and the health exception had to be broad enough that there were virtually no limits. So it included economic, psychological, familial status, age, all of that sort of criteria. And in fact, there has been testimony in Congress by one abortion provider that anytime a woman was unhappy with her pregnancy, that constituted a health exception. And that was actually the ruling of the California State Supreme Court when they looked at how their psychological health exception was being abused. So Paul and I decided to, on behalf of the Pro-Life Center, bring this issue to the court, attention of the court, to say, in overruling Roe and Casey, please be cognizant that you have this other case out there that if you don't address it, could become the exception that resurrects all of this bad law and infrastructure, that any health, and we're seeing that, right? We're seeing that in the battle over secret gender transitioning of our children in schools, right? That we have a corrupted health system with too many physicians and other healthcare professionals who believe that they have the answers and that parents are an impediment to what they believe is the way children's lives should be conducted. So we were very concerned about it. In all honesty, Paul wrote the opinion. I edited or wrote the brief because I was busy on 2 other briefs, and I'm so grateful for him doing that for us. So the Pro-Life Center has that advantage. That was one of the 3. It's a very short brief. I'm happy to make it available to you so you can make it available to others if you want. And it talks about the problems with the health exception, particularly psychological health. The second brief was the brief that I actually had reached out to Helen Alvarez and to Erica Bacciacci, who you may have met or will in the future. Helen used to be the pro-life spokeswoman for the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops. Beautiful, articulate, Hispanic woman, Columbia law grad, brilliant. She teaches at George Mason. Wow. And so I had reached out to Helen. Helen and I are friends from way back. And then Erica, of course, is one of the emerging scholars that has a new book out on the history of women's progress in American society. She's very strongly pro-life. She's been involved in the founding of a private school for young people. She's a very gifted, independent scholar. And so I reached out to Helen and said, Helen, we need to deal with Planned Parenthood versus Casey's statement that women and men have come to depend upon abortion in the event contraception shall fail. and that access to abortion has in fact improved women's access to the political and social aspects of our society.
Mm-hmm.
So Helen and I had both been working on this concept. I delivered literally dozens of lectures at various law schools across the country that talked about sort of an authentic women's history of progress in this country and how it's completely unconnected to access to abortion. And there is some evidence that abortion on demand has actually limited women's ability to make the sort of important structural changes that are required so that women can be welcomed in the public square and in the workplace as full human beings and not simply some sort of defective version of the male, right? Because as a former small business owner, I can tell you accommodating pregnancy when you have 10 employees, and the employee that's pregnant is a major employee, someone who manages one of your retail stores. It's a little breathtaking when they tell you, hey, I know this is a bridal salon, but I'm going to be delivering my baby during prom season. No! Right? But of course, the right answer is, congratulations, that's awesome. And so once you swallow hard and get past the impulse of no, to that's awesome, you work it out. And so there's some evidence that the availability of abortion is, instead of working it out, you say, as Michael Bloomberg is reported to have said, get rid of it. We can't accommodate you being a female,
Mm-hmm.
right? Men don't get pregnant and they don't cause this problem. So there's some evidence. And so that was really the theme of our brief. We were able, through the assistance of another great pro-life woman law professor, Elizabeth Kirk, to identify 240 women, all of which had doctorate degrees, PhDs, JDs, MDs, whatever. If you had a D at the end of the degree, you were invited to join us, making the case that Casey was just wrong when it presumed that abortion was a necessary predicate to women's advancement. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later, but then there was a third brief. I have a former graduate who was a research assistant of mine, Renee Carlson, who now works for the Minnesota Family Foundation or Minnesota Family Policy Council. And they wanted to file a brief that in some ways previewed the arguments that you find made in the new book about how abortion harms everything, that was just released. Great book. Very nice introduction. In fact, I have my bedstand copy.
Oh, I've heard about that. Alexandra DeSanctis and
Ryan
co-writer. Yes.
And I'm not the author. I don't get a dime of royalties, but it's a very good summary of, and the endnotes are terrific if you're looking for resources. So, but our family brief ended up being written by the America First, or on behalf of the American First Foundation, which of course was established by former Vice President Michael Pence, as well as a number of family policy organizations. And we basically outlined the fact that independent of the death of the child, which of course is the paramount evil that comes from abortion on demand, we also see things like the assault on parental rights. I mean, again, going back to the judicial bypass, where there's no other place in American law where a person can be deprived of constitutionally recognized rights, the rights of parents to direct the upbringing of their children, by a proceeding that they are not allowed to know is happening, not allowed to appear at, not allowed to speak at, and yet their rights are stripped of them. And so this intrusion into the parent-child relationship is just breathtaking. So we talked about that. We talked about the epidemic of sexually transmitted diseases. We talked about the harm to young people, the depression, the increasing depression. And so it was a more global critique of what the fruits of abortion on demand have been. So those were the three briefs. It was, I was on sabbatical that semester, had planned to write a couple of law review articles, but instead wrote three briefs, which my dean graciously accepted as my scholarly contribution. So,
Oh, that's great. Well, I often get a chance to speak towards the kind of pro-life women's brief, but I hear some of the similar threads throughout some of them. But the reality is that women don't need abortion in order to be successful. It's not an either or. You can have your babies planned or unplanned and do great things. And so one of the things that I talk about occasionally when I share my story is that, I was 22 years old, married, 3 months in, and on contraceptives, they failed. Bam, I was pregnant, finishing my biomedical engineering degree, very difficult journey. I had to adjust my graduation time, graduated with a baby on my hip, commuting an hour and a half to A&M from Austin that last year and a half. And was it easy? No, but looking back now, my son is 25. It's something that grew my husband and I. Unplanned things happen in life in general, and we adjust to those things. And it creates the beautiful tapestry of life when we get down the road and we look back. Some of the most beautiful outcomes come from those unexpected moments or unexpected blessings. And so I'm very grateful for that. But so often women are told that they have to choose, that in order to be successful. We hear it a lot from Hollywood women, that they have to choose to not have their babies and pursue their careers. That's not the case at all. Women have been advancing for a very long time. I've read some of your work that states that women were already advancing career-wise in the 1900s before abortion was legalized. And so I would love to just hear your thoughts on that brief, a little bit more on that perspective and that reality that women do not have to choose family, planned or unplanned children over advancement in their careers.
It's a cruel position to say that in order for women to be able to utilize the gifts and talents that God has given them to help build a better society, a kinder, safer society, that we have to deny our reproductive capacity. It is a sort of lie that one can only imagine comes from a very selfish place and a place that prioritizes efficiency and wealth over community and joy.
Right.
So in our brief, we set forth some of the history of this country. One of the interesting things to me is that Frances Perkins was the first cabinet member in Washington, D.C. that was a woman. And what I find really interesting is not only did she serve as Secretary of Labor, but she served during the darkest days of the Depression. And I think that really says a lot. It says a lot about women's capacities. It says a lot about women's opportunities. And she served admirably and was a very good Secretary of Labor. At that time, we were seeing, women entering into the legislative branch. We've seen today, for example, there are more women attending law school and medical school than there are men.
Wow.
And in reality, there is some conversation that you see going on about the fact that there is an increasing imbalance of women's educational activities with that of men, and whether that is in fact influencing the pattern we're seeing of declining marriage rates. And certainly you don't have to be on a college campus very long or in a graduate program very long not to hear the concerns both of the women students that where are all the good men? I postponed dating. I postponed getting into a serious relationship. I'm now ready to graduate from law school. And the good men are either married or on a Catholic campus in the seminary. And so, how does this work in reality? And so we talked a little bit about, this long history of women's achievement. One of the things that Roe did allow us to do is we did what is called an economics and natural experiment, right? We went from a country where abortion was largely discouraged. There were 7 or 8 states that had legalized it, like New York, like Hawaii, one even by a statewide referendum, but far more regulated than what Roe versus Wade handed to us. Particularly in conjunction with Doe v. Bolton, that health exception case. And so one of the things that we talked about was we took all of the government data on the reported abortion rate and compared to pregnancy completion, et cetera, and also the ratio. And then we, for each year, looked at women's participation in the labor force, women's achievements academically, women's poverty rates, women's average income, women's, all of these indicators that on a global level are often used to say that women are advancing or are not advancing, at least in the economic life of the country. And what we found is there's just zero. That's not true. There are individual years where you would look at it and you would think, oh, there's an increase of abortion rates and women are going to college more. But the very next year, you wouldn't see it. And so there's no consistent correlation. The first 20 years after Roe, the abortion rate skyrocketed in this country. I honestly think probably they increased beyond even what Justice Blackmun anticipated. Wow. I think the justices gravely mistakenly, but nonetheless, honestly believe that it would remain a relatively rare procedure, that the medical profession would not resort to it, and there certainly wouldn't be this industry that's developed, the abortion industry itself, independent, very much like the tobacco industry, that there would be this
like safe, legal, and rare is what we used to hear.
Exactly, right. Which now Vice President Kamala Harris doesn't believe that. Hillary Clinton, I mean, you have the Shout Your Abortion movement. And in fact, Congress, there was a memo among the House of Representatives pro-choice caucus saying they should no longer use the phrase pro-choice because it makes it sound like there might be some question about it or moral responsibility for it.
Oh, wow.
And so it really, the aggressiveness is sort of breathtaking. So we talked about this history and the fact that we've had, women senators and judges and professors and doctors and lawyers and all of those indicia. We also talked about all of the different laws that were passed that go all the way back to the 1930s as well, for equal pay, for the Supreme Court cases, because there's no doubt that in the 40s and 50s, there were real injustices. The public school teacher who's married, who's starting to show at the 4th month, who's told she has to quit because we didn't want children, I guess, to understand that babies grow in mommy's tummies, whatever. I mean, so we gave the court all of that information. We gave them our correlation tables and simply made the case that, the Casey plurality opinion, where they say that it is a prerequisite to women's advancement, we've got 50 years of data and it's just not true. It's not supportable. The other thing that I'd close my answer with is it was kind of shocking what the Casey justices relied on in making that statement. When you look at the footnote, they rely on one book. Now, remember, they're interpreting the Constitution of the United States, right? They look at one book written by a Marxist feminist professor.
Wow.
Okay. I'm not sure there were many Marxist feminists at the Constitutional Convention or even in Congress in the 1860s when we did the 14th Amendment. And it just strikes me as an odd source to rely on. But separate and independent of that, when you actually read the book, the woman doesn't say that. She in fact says quite the opposite. She says that as women advance in society and have all these other opportunities, there will be an increasing demand for abortion, not that abortion leads to women having these opportunities. So it really, as Justice Alito showed in his masterful majority opinion in Dobbs,
Yes.
it was made up law based on political preferences of the justices. And that is deeply problematic in lots of ways. So
Very
that was the
unfortunate.
case we made.
Yes, very unfortunate that they made the decision they made. There is no constitutional right to abortion, which we've now seen. And so I'm very pleased to see that the Supreme Court righted that wrong. And that's only happened a few times in history where we've seen them overturn precedent to correct something that was decided in error. And so it shows the bravery and the courage of our justices. And at the end of the day, they don't do what they do for popular opinion. They're not swayed by popular opinion. And so I have the utmost respect for the fact that they just look at the Constitution, they look at the cases before them, and they evaluate without allowing a lot of the outside noise in. And if ever there was a time that we could see that, it was here where the unprecedented leak happened. So kind of an interesting unfolding of it all.
And, the behavior subsequently, right? But even before, right? Senator Schumer on the steps in the Texas case, right? On the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Threatening two of the justices. Chief Justice Roberts is deeply concerned about the institutional reputation of the court. Even he was moved, though, to reprimand Senator Schumer by his behavior. And the fact that we've got an Attorney General of the United States who at one point was a nominee for the Supreme Court, who refuses to enforce the law that prohibits, with criminal sanctions, protesting outside of a judge's home to influence the opinion is just mind-boggling to me. And their failure to actively enforce the Free Access to Clinic Entrance Act penalties against those who are destroying pregnancy assistance centers. I am befuddled by the idea that people who claim to be in favor of women having the choice to continue or terminate their pregnancy want to destroy the resources that are free and necessary for women who choose to, who are in economically troubled times. And yet it's just, and our federal government has, instead of trying to actually address that, has increased protection of the abortion clinics.
It makes zero sense to me. There's so many ways that we can support women facing unplanned pregnancies and applaud our organizations and our pregnancy help centers that do. And just to show how pro-abortion extreme so many of the members of Congress are, so many in the administration of the Biden-Harris administration are, we see the continued pushing for further advancements really in taking lives, not saving lives. And it's just unfortunate. It shows where our country is and on this issue, how lost so many are. And we will continue to do what we do. That's why we advocate for life. It's just a new chapter in the same book, and it's going to unfold in a different way now that it's going to be able to be handled on a state by state basis. But still, we see all the moves to even circumvent the voters and the states and to codify Roe, and should we get rid of the filibuster? And it's amazing how much life, breath, energy, and money people who are on that pro-abortion extremist side, how much they will invest in the taking of unborn babies' lives. And it's just so sad to see that there is such a lack of value there for life and the sanctity of life. And so we continue to advocate. I feel like I could talk to you all day. I wish I could go to coffee with you, but I probably need to go ahead and wrap this up, but hopefully we can have you back on another time. But I am going to recommend that book. I'm going to read it, actually probably order it today for those of us in the office because we haven't read it yet. So we can read it, as well as put a link to your briefs for our viewers if they're interested in learning more. But I want to thank you for being with us. Thank you, everybody, for watching, for tuning in to our TAL update. We appreciate you, and we hope to see you again next week.